Hi, it's Mr. Bennett, and in this video what we're going to talk about is we're going to talk a little bit more about the cell membrane. Now in our last video what we talked about how the function of the cell membrane is it controls what goes in and out of the cell. Well, in this video what we're going to do is we're going to talk about how it does it. Now when most people think about the cell membrane, they think of something like a wall. They think of something that's like a physical barrier that makes it so something can't go from one side to the other. And in this picture you can actually kind of see that going on here, that here we have the cell membrane. This whole area right here, that's the cell membrane. This is the inside of the cell down here, and this is the outside of the cell up here. And you can see that things are obviously a lot different inside the cell than they are outside the cell. And the reason for that is the cell membrane. The cell membrane is what's controlling what goes in and out of the cell. In this video what we're going to talk about is we're going to talk about the specifics of how the cell membrane is able to pull that off. Now, to understand how the cell membrane goes about doing its job, we need to understand what the cell membrane is built out of. So let's talk about the structure of the cell membrane for a second. Another name for the cell membrane is the phospholipid bilayer. Now, the reason why it's called the phospholipid bilayer is because it's made out of two layers of phospholipids. These molecules right here you're looking at, each one of these is a phospholipid, and you can see we've got a double layer of it. I like to think of the phospholipid bilayer as kind of like being Velcro. Here's the smooth part, here's the sticky part, and here's another smooth part down there sticking together. So this is what the cell membrane looks like. It's made out of a bunch of these molecules called phospholipids. And if you look at this electron microscope picture, you can see the phospholipid bilayer. There's one layer right there. There's another layer right there. So you can actually physically see the way that the cell membrane is made. This is an important thing to keep in mind, that the cell membrane is actually a double layer made out of molecules called phospholipids. So about now, some of you may be asking, what the freak is a phospholipid? We know that the cell membrane is made up of a bunch of them put together. Well, a good way to think of a phospholipid is to the cell membrane what a brick is to a wall. That it takes a bunch of phospholipids put together in order to make the cell membrane. And so you could think of each one of these bricks as being like an individual phospholipid. So one phospholipid by itself isn't much, but if you take a whole bunch of them and put them together, you have a cell membrane. Now, there's some important characteristics we need to know about phospholipids and what they're made out of. Phospholipids are made out of two types of molecules. They're made out of a fat, or a lipid, and this is the lipid part of the phospholipid right there. And they're also made out of a phosphate group right up here. If you remember back to our second unit in this class, we talked about phosphates and we talked about lipids. And so that is what a phospholipid is made out of. It's made out of a phosphate group here, and it's got two fatty acids attached to it. Way I think about it, I think a phospholipid looks like a sperm with two tails. That's really what they look like. You got the head of it right there, and then the two tails are going to be the lipids that make up the phospholipid. All right, so now what we talked about phospholipids are, it's time to talk about the characteristics of phospholipids. That the characteristics of phospholipids is what really makes it so the cell membrane can do its job. So because the phospholipids are made out of two different types of molecules, remember you got a phosphate part up here, and then you've got lipid down here. All this part is lipid. Phospholipids, the different parts of the phospholipid have different characteristics. So first off, we're going to talk about the phosphates right up here and the characteristics of the phosphate group. First thing to know about the phosphate group is it is polar. It's got a positive and a negative region. And so phosphate groups have a negative charge. Right up here on the surface, every one of these phospholipids has a negative charge right there. That's the first thing to remember about a phospholipid, is the phosphate part of the phospholipid has a negative charge. Now, because of that, this makes it so it is hydrophilic. It loves water. Remember, phosphates are polar. They have a negative region to them, and water likes to bind to things that are polar. So this negative region up here of all these phospholipids is going to attract water to it, because water loves things that has a charge. And so the phosphate part of the phospholipid has a negative charge, making it a polar molecule. And because it's a polar molecule, water loves to attach to it. We have a term for that. We call that hydrophilic. Something that water loves to mix with is hydrophilic, taken from the word hydro, which means water, and philic, which means to love. So that's the characteristics of the phosphate part of the phospholipid. Now the lipid tails are almost entirely the opposite. So we're talking about this part down here. We're talking about the lipid region of the phospholipid. Now, the lipid tails are hydrophobic. They do not like water. Now, you should be able to realize this because these guys are made out of fat, and fat does not like to mix with water whatsoever. Now, the reason why the lipid tails are hydrophobic, once again, taken from the word hydro for water and phobic, which means scared of, these lipid tails do not like to mix with water. And the reason for that is they're nonpolar. They have no charge. Remember, water will mix with a polar molecule. It avoids a nonpolar molecule the way I avoid Raiders fans because it does not like to mix with them. So that's two very important things to keep in mind about the phospholipid bilayer. That of the phospholipids, you got the phosphate part that is a negative charge, making it hydrophilic, and then you have the lipid part, which has no charge, which makes it hydrophobic. Now, the cell membrane, or another name for the cell membrane is the plasma membrane, is not just made out of phospholipids. That actually in the cell membrane, you're also going to find proteins that are going to be in there. There's a couple of different types of them. We're not going to get too caught up on it, but the two different types of proteins that you find in the cell membrane are what are called peripheral proteins and integral proteins. This is a peripheral protein down here. This is an integral protein right here. I'll explain the difference to that in just a second. You can see in our cell membrane that here we have our phospholipids. We got phospholipids here, here, and here. You can see your sperm with two tails everywhere forming our lipid bilayer. Now, we've got these proteins that are attached to the cell membrane. This is a peripheral protein, and the reason why this is a peripheral protein is it does not stretch all the way across the cell membrane. This is an integral protein, which crosses the entire cell membrane. So I'm not going to worry too much about the difference between peripheral and integral proteins. I want you to know that there are proteins in the cell membrane, and what they're there for is cell-to-cell communication and for membrane transport. Some of these proteins are going to be involved in accepting signals from other cells. Some of these proteins, specifically the integral proteins, are going to be involved in getting things either in or out of the cell. And so that's why we need to talk about proteins now, is that we're going to be talking about how things get in and out of the cell, and these proteins are going to play a big role in getting some big things in or out of the cell. So remember, the cell membrane is not just made out of phospholipids. There's proteins that are in there too. So now that we've talked about the structure of the cell membrane, that's made out of phospholipids and a double layer, and we've talked about that it's got proteins in it, now we can finally start talking about how the cell membrane does its job. Now, when it comes down to the structure of the cell membrane, the way the cell membrane is built makes it so that there are three major things that control whether or not something can get in or out of the cell based on the structure of the cell membrane. First one we're going to talk about is we're going to talk about size. Now, when you talk about the cell membrane, what you got going on there is the cell membrane is made out of phospholipids, and the tops of the phospholipids are circles. Now, that plays a huge role because if you look at the phospholipid bilayer, looking at it this way, so you're looking down on the phosphate heads, this is what you're going to see down here. You're going to see a bunch of circles lined up that way. Now, the reason why this is important is, as you can see in this picture, that when you have a bunch of circles, you cannot make a complete wall using only circles because you have gaps right there between the circles that cannot be filled in. It is the same way with the cell membrane. There are tiny gaps in the cell membrane, and through these tiny gaps, small little molecules like oxygen, carbon dioxide, water, these tiny little molecules, they can shoot right into these gaps and go in and out of the cell, and the cell membrane can do nothing about it. So that's what I mean when I say that it's a little bit more complex than saying that the cell membrane controls what goes in and out of the cell. The cell membrane has no control over carbon dioxide, oxygen, or water. These things go in and out of the cell, and there's nothing the cell membrane can do about it. Now, if you take a bigger molecule, let's say like glucose, this molecule is obviously too big to fit inside of one of these gaps. And so for big molecules like glucose and proteins and so forth. The cell membrane can block these things from getting inside of the cell, but for tiny little molecules, because of these gaps, the cell membrane cannot stop these tiny molecules from going in or out of the cell. How I think of it is I think of it like a chain link fence. Here you see in this picture that we've got a bear back here in the background. Now this bear cannot get through the fence. He is too big. He's kind of like a glucose molecule. He can't fit through the holes in the fence. But if you have something like a bee or a fly, these guys can go right through that fence and not even slow down because they're so small they can fit through the gaps in the fence. The cell membrane is set up the same way. It's got gaps in it, so small things can go across it without even slowing down, whereas big things is what the cell membrane is really going to control what gets in and out of the cell. The next thing we need to talk about that determines if something can get in and out of the cell is its charge. Does it have a positive or a negative charge? Now, if you haven't had physical science, what you got going on here is things can have a magnetic charge. They can either have a positive charge or they can have a negative charge. Now, what's going on is positive and negative charges are attracted to each other. But if you try to force two positive charges together, these guys are going to push off of each other, and it's the same way with two negative charges. Well, if you remember earlier, I told you that all of these phosphate heads on the cell membrane, all of these phosphate heads have a negative charge. So if you have a molecule coming in and it's got a negative charge to it and it tries to cross this phosphate membrane, phospholipid bilayer, it's not going to be able to do it because when you put two negative charges together, they push off of each other. And so anything with a negative charge is going to have a really hard time getting across the cell membrane. Things with positive charges are going to have an easier time because a positive charged molecule is going to be attracted to these negative charges on the phospholipid bilayer, and so it's going to be easier for something with a positive charge to cross the cell membrane than it is for something with a negative charge to cross the cell membrane. Okay, the last thing we need to talk about of the three things that determine if something can enter or leave a cell is it depends if the molecule is hydrophobic or if it is hydrophilic. Now, hopefully you remember that I taught you that this part of the cell membrane is going to be hydrophilic right here, whereas the lipid part of the cell membrane, the lipid part down here, is going to be hydrophobic. It doesn't like water. Well, what this comes down to is it isn't just water. Hydrophobic things do not like to mix with hydrophilic things. And so if you have a molecule, and this molecule is hydrophilic, and it tries to cross the cell membrane, it's going to come in and it's going to hit the hydrophobic lipid part, and it won't be able to get across it. Things that are hydrophilic have a hard time getting across the cell membrane because they get stuck in the lipid part of the cell membrane that is hydrophobic, that does not like hydrophilic things. And so that's going to determine if something can get across the cell membrane or not. So once again, the three things that can control whether or not something can cross the cell membrane is size. If something's really small, it can cross easily. If it's bigger, it's harder for it to cross. Whether it has a positive or a negative charge. Things that have a negative charge have a hard time getting across the cell membrane because of the negatively charged phosphate heads. And then whether or not it's hydrophobic or hydrophilic. Hydrophilic things have a hard time getting across the cell membrane because they can't get through the lipid part of the phospholipid bilayer. And that's the basics of the cell membrane, how it's built and how it controls what gets in and out of the cell. In our next video, we're going to talk about the processes used by the cell so that things can get in and out of the cell.